yeah, it's really my pleasure to introduce Professor Hornbacher to all of you. And Professor Hornbacher is an very outstanding scholar, no doubt, and with various academic backgrounds ranging from philosophy, ethnology to German study. During the last decade, she has conducted numerous fascinating field works in Indonesia, and most of which have a specific focus on the Bali Islands. And her research topic cover religion, politics, culture, local tradition, rituals, and so on, in which we can profoundly understand Bali Island and Javanese culture from like different aspects. And Indonesia is a highly diverse country in terms of its religion, like where we can see people having like various religious beliefs, including Buddhism, Protestantism, Islam, and Hinduism. And that is why it could be an excellent site to see inter-religion interaction, integration, and even conflict. So I believe that everyone is now very looking forward to the lecture we are going to have today. So yeah, so maybe let me just hand it over to Professor Hornbacher. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this friendly and very helpful introduction, because this is actually exactly what I wanted to say in the beginning, that the investigation of how religion has become a major topic and how it enables interreligious contact and relations was a topic of research for me for many years now, but always in the context of Indonesia, which paradigmatic in respects, but also complementary to this lecture series, which, as far as I can see, is focusing on South Asia and the Hindu-Muslim encounters in this region. So when I look at these encounters from an Indonesian perspective, this contrasts to India because Indonesia is the world's most populous Islamic country that hosts only a very small Hindu minority of 1.7% of its population. And I will show you a map, perhaps, I'm still struggling a bit with this technology, a map just to give you an idea of where Indonesia is located and how extended this archipelago state is from the western part here in, oh, can I have a cursor, in Sumatra, down to the most eastern part, which is actually part of Papua. And in terms of religion, you can see here everything that is green are Muslim majorities. Hindu majorities are only to be found in Bali, still until today, 19%, even though this changes dramatically. In the cities of Bali, you have already more than half of the population, which is Islamic, Muslim. And you have in the eastern part of Indonesia, Christian. This is all, of course, part and due to colonial history, which then became a major factor during the struggle for independence and for a pluralist politics of religion. So this small religious minority has gained global recognition, the minority of Balinese in this case, because they are the smallest group, recognition since the 1930s when Bali was advertised, still under Dutch colonial rule, as a destination for cultural tourism and as a tropical paradise inhabited by a graceful people who were artists and farmers at the same time. This is the myth, basically, of all Balinese being artists. And here you see one of the first very famous Legong dancers. And what you probably don't see is that this is a boy, because before mass tourism, all Balinese dances were performed by men and boys, also the Legong dance by specifically trained young boys. So this is as I said, the myth of Balinese as artists and farmers at the same time. And since the opening of the international airport in 1972, Bali has also become a focus of global mass tourism and is famous as the island of the gods or the island of the 1,000 temples. There are these lavish, extravagant rituals that are ruining now Balinese because they have become very costly, since Balinese are no longer simply farmers, but work in the service for tourism. They have to buy these fruits, and this is an issue in itself that has become very problematic for Balinese today. But still, the attraction for cultural tourism is based exactly on these colorful rituals and the unique, stunningly beautiful culture in an equally beautiful natural environment. That has led to a very unique situation. In Bali, you have today more tourists per year than Balinese residents. So, but who are these residents after all? Well, travel guides as well as anthropologists tend to describe Bali as the last Hindu enclave in a sea of Indonesian Islam, because the Balinese royalty was in close contact with the Shaiva Buddhist royal centers of Java since the 10th or 11th century. And after the advent of Islam in Java, 13th century onward, Bali became the last resort of the legendary Shaiva Javanese of Majapahit. And here you see a map that shows Majapahit during its largest extension in the entire archipelago. That was founded, Majapahit was founded at the end of the 13th century, and the rulers extended their political and also, which is perhaps more important, their cultural influence during the following centuries from Sumatra and Malaysia in the eastern part down to West Papua. So it's actually larger than the Indonesian state these days. But while only ruins reveal the former glory of this Shaiva Buddhist realm in Java, many of its cultural traditions survived in Bali that was deeply influenced by Majapahit, especially after the defeat of the old Balinese kingdom of Varmadeva during the 14th century. This is basically the time which shows the realm of Majapahit on this map. As a result, core features of Java's courtly culture have survived in Bali until today, such as the caste system, the ritual authority of the Shaiva high priest, the Ida Pedanda, hundreds of palm leaf manuscripts with excellent old Javanese poetry that was, by the way, discovered for the first time by Wilhelm von Humboldt, who wrote his introduction to the Kavi work in view of these poetic texts, and also esoteric texts, so-called tutur, which haven't yet been translated in European languages because they were secret traditions of the Brahmin priests and other specialists. And of course, part of this culture was also the courtly rituals, dances, musical traditions, the gamelan orchestra, shadow plays, practically everything that we nowadays associate with Bali and Bali's culture. All of this evolved at the paradigmatic royal centers, which were centers of spiritual as well as political power, because the kings were regarded as incarnation of Shiva, as divinities. Basically, they were referred to as our Batara, our gods, by the Balinese. And here you see from the early times, one of the Shaiva high priests, the Ida Padanda, to which I will refer later on more often. During the century in which Bali developed emblematic ritual tradition, the rest of the archipelago converted to Islam, which is currently the religion of roughly 90% of the Indonesians. But, and this is the question, does this mean that Bali is a small Hindu island in the middle of an Islamic archipelago? And would that explain why Bali has recently become a focus of interreligious conflict, when in 2002 and 2005, more than 200 people were killed and even more have been injured during an Islamist bomb attack on the hotspots of Bali's economy and wealth, the tourism centers of Kuta and Jimbaran in South Bali, where many tourists, but also many Balinese had been killed. There is no doubt that Balinese regard themselves today as Hindu, and that the terror attacks have considerably changed their relations with Indian Muslims. Before the attack, Balinese would always emphasize that there were no interreligious problems whatsoever because all religions were equally valued in Indonesia, and it did not matter if somebody was Muslim or Hindu or Christian, which is, by the way, also the reason why Balinese would always invite you as a visitor to pray with them in their temples if you are properly dressed in Bali's ritual dress, because in their opinion, it does really not matter what you believe. What matters is if you pray correctly. And they all assume that you somehow are a person who refers to a religious entity, a god. And it's not so important how you call this god. But this has changed dramatically after the so-called Bali that killed so many people and destroyed Balinese economy, but shattered also the confidence of its residents that Balinese Hinduism was regarded as equal by Muslim co-citizens. For the first time since independence in 1949, Balinese understood their precarious situation in a Muslim country where they were but a tiny religious minority. However, was this an interreligious conflict between Hindus and Muslims, and where did it emerge? I will argue that this assumption is too simplistic because it considers religions as entities or consistent and mutually exclusive ideologies, which obfuscates the fact that Balinese were never isolating themselves from Muslims, rather on the contrary, as we will see. Oops, that seems to be the wrong one. Wait. On the contrary, as we will see. Moreover, Balinese did not regard themselves as Hindu until very recently. They were forced to adopt an identity in terms of a proper religion, which happened first under the influence of Dutch colonial politics in early 20th century, and then under the pressure of the post-colonial Indonesian state and its religious politics since the late 1940s. Thus, it was only in relation to powerful political changes that Balinese began to identify themselves as different, as representatives of a different religion from their neighbors, and they identified this difference in terms of two basically Western concepts to which I will come back later, one of which was culture and the other religion. And whereas the Indonesian constitution guarantees religious pluralism and tolerance to all citizens, despite its Muslim majority, this guarantee is based on a modern paradigm of religion as a personal belief system, as a consistent doctrine that justifies and demands the exclusive affiliation to different social groups and ideologies. I argue, therefore, that Indonesian religious politics, and especially the introduction of the concept of religion as a doctrine rather than a ritual practice, is one precondition for interreligious conflicts that became an issue only after independence. But before I elaborate this thesis with a description of what it meant for Balinese to become Hindu, I would like to add some more information on the history of Indonesia. Indonesian Islam and Hinduism as well are not only geographically at the margins of the origin regions of both religions, the same applies to the Indonesian interpretation of these traditions. Indonesian Islam is praised as paradigmatically tolerant and peaceful, especially in its Javanese version, where Islam is closely connected with local traditions of animism and ancestor worship on the one hand, and on the other, with mystical rather than orthodox traditions that were introduced according to legend by the 9 Sufi, the Wali Songo, who during the 14th century. This allowed a combination of Islam with earlier Shaiva and Buddhist traditions that had reached the archipelago along the maritime trade route between India and China during the first centuries of the Common Era, and shaped the early kingdoms of Kalimantan, Sumatra, and Java that were in contact with the subcontinent and adopted as well as reinterpreted many cultural features of Indic origin, like stone carving, architecture, poetry, cosmology, philosophy, and so forth. And here you see two of those paradigmatic places in central Java. One is the Trimurti Shaiva temple or Chandi Rasa Prambanan from the 9th century, and the other is the what used to be the world's largest Buddhist sanctuary, the Borobudur, in nearby, in very close proximity, that was soon after abandoned and has been re-excavated and rebuilt with help of the UNESCO as a World Heritage, and is now become a place of worship for Buddhists from all over the world. Especially esoteric and tantric traditions, both of Shaiva and Buddhist persuasion, were also aiming at the union of the individual and God, and they could easily be connected with Sufi traditions of Islam. Until today, Balinese specialists of esoteric learning and healing, who are experts in a Balinese genre of tantric palm leaf manuscript, the so-called tutur, travel across Bali, but also to Java in their search for esoteric practitioners or gurus famous for their ability to raise the mystical cosmic power, the so-called Sakti. And those of you who work in India will, of course, think of Shakti, and that's what it basically is, for the sake of healing or killing. During my fieldwork, I met several of these Balinese practitioners who had studied Balinese magic with renowned Muslim healers in Java. To them, religious differences didn't matter at all, but only the guru's ability to activate this mystical power and then to basically support their education as Balian, as they are called in Bali. And because East Java is famous for its strong magical traditions, several Muslim healers have also Balinese clients or are specialized on rituals that allow them to heal Balinese clients. On the other hand, Balinese Hindus in East Bali, which is in close historic and current contact with the predominantly Muslim island of Lombok, have integrated Muslim jinn, spirits, in their local demonology, and Hindu practitioners treat or exorcise them with the help of Balinese rituals. Other form of integrative Islam are practiced in central Java, where Javanese Muslim farmers venerate Hindu deities from the Mahabharata, for example, the goddess Kunti, in small shrines on their fields to guarantee fertility without regarding this as a theological problem. Similar forms of interreligious inclusion have been practiced for centuries between Buddhist and Shaiva traditions in Sumatra, Java, and Bali. Balinese ritual practices present a complex combination of a Shaiva and Buddhist cosmology and philosophy on the one hand, and local forms of worship of divine ancestors and the many powerful beings inhabiting the invisible part of the visible world. So that's very important from the Balinese perspective. The world is basically a complementary balance between material reality, called Sakala, and invisible agents called Niskala. These nameless deities are dwelling in trees, rocks, animals, holy spring, crossroads of streets, in computers, in the entrance gates of houses, and in the shelves of supermarkets. All of these are places where Balinese will put such small offerings to respect, as they would call it, to respect the deities dwelling in these places. There is virtually no purely secular space in Bali's highly immanent religious life, which has therefore been labeled as animistic. But what matters in all of these cases historically, as well as currently in Bali, is the ritual integration of different theological traditions and traditions of worship, which was the fundamental basis of social harmony until recently, not only in the Malay archipelago, but in many Southeast Asian societies where the personal creed was not so relevant for the ritual participants. This applies also to mixed Muslim Christian families in southern Thailand or in Sumatra. Family members meet and respect each other as long as all of them are willing to worship the clan ancestors of the deities in the holy places of their environment. And that is a result of the interdisciplinary research group in which colleagues from Paris and other universities in Germany were looking at these dynamics of religions towards purification and also towards conflict in different places such as Burma or Thailand and also in Indonesia. So in all of these cases, it was clear the more purified a religion became, the more strict in terms of its doctrine, the more conflict would emerge. Interestingly, the modern Indonesian state emphasizes the aspect of traditional interreligious harmony and peace as an identity marker of the multi-religious and multi-ethnic Indonesian state, and above all of Indonesian Islam. But this has become problematic because orthodox forms, especially of Islam, are currently defining the public Indonesian discourse and have gained increasing influence vis-à-vis the still predominantly integrative Muslim society on the one hand, and the secular as well as neoliberal politics on the other. Here you see, just as an emblematic photo, one for many going on the streets in Java and protesting for jihad and against a secular Western society. But still, paradigmatic for Indonesian religious politics is the motto of the Indonesian state, which is Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, usually translated as unity in diversity. And here you can see this is taught to children in school books and explained in terms of religious pluralism. You see representatives of all world religions with this motto Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, happily holding hands and thus representing the pluralist and harmonious Pancasila state, the integrative state of Indonesia. The motto was chosen and actually rediscovered by the first Indonesian president Sukarno from the classical old Javanese poem Sutasoma, written by a Buddhist court poet in praise of his Shaiva king. In this poem, he declares Buddha and Shiva as different, but ultimately the same, which suggests that the integration and recognition of different creeds was more important than syncretism. So it was not so important, as we will later see, to gloss over those differences, but rather to emphasize them and to make sure that they were integrated, and there was a default position to say they are equal ultimately. And that meant in practice that Buddhist and Shaiva high priests were officiating together during the 14th century in the court rituals of the king, as another poem, the poem Nagara Kertagama shows. And the same ritual integration of different theological teachings and authorities is practiced until today in important Balinese temple rituals. For certain rituals, initiated Balinese Buddhist high priests, the so-called Ida Bodha, have to initiate side by side with the Shaiva high priest, the Ida Padanda Shiva, whom I showed you in a picture before, who actually represents the highest spiritual authority for many Balinese, because he is supposed to transform himself into Lord Shiva every day by virtue of his meditation, his mantras, and his mudras. So this ritual integration of different theological traditions and authorities, rather than theological or doctrinal purification, manifests also what the political scientist Benedict Anderson described as the mystical power, the kesakten, attributed to Javanese kings, and today sometimes to Indonesian politicians. Kings, but also the tantric specialists that I've mentioned before, traveling to Java, had to display supernatural power by performing ability to integrate obviously different influences, tradition, and people into their realm as a performative demonstration of their wealth. Difference was therefore regarded as a source of power rather than a potential disobedience. But whereas this ritual integration was often described with regard to the Shaiva Buddhist kingdoms of Java and Bali, it is not yet sufficiently recognized that this applies also to Bali's Shaiva kings after the fall of Majapahit. So far from isolating themselves from their Muslim neighbors, the kings established diverse and often close relationships with them, which means the idea that Bali was a purely Hindu resort for an old Indic philosophy or religion, or as the Orientalists from the Netherlands saw it, a museum of the old Majapahit society that withdrew from Islam, was wrong. This doesn't mean that the divine kings were interested in Islam as a religion. Rather, it meant that they did not identify themselves and others in terms of religion. The Balinese king from Gelgel, and this one is the one from Buleleng, and I should perhaps add that Bali did not simply have one king, but many kings, which is amazing because it's a relatively small island. But all of these kings were dominating and had their own subjects, and they were centers of their own ritual culture. So this one is from the north coast in Buleleng. And he is in a Muslim dress, actually, that seemed to be fashionable at that time. And you can see that even though he was a Hindu king, actually representing Shiva, that doesn't prevent him from simply playing with such Islamic emblems, as well as working together with Muslims, as we will see in a minute. The very famous Balinese king from Gelgel, next to Klungkung in the south of Bali, relied on Muslim troops from Java during the 16th century, and he granted them the right to establish a settlement, which is until today the Muslim Banjar or hamlet in the city of Klungkung, a very old Muslim settlement in Bali. And there were many other such places. In North Bali, Muslim descendants who brought gifts to a Balinese king with whom they had defeated another king in Java were also given land, and they are the inhabitants of the oldest Muslim village in Bali and have established long-term peaceful relations to their Balinese Hindu neighbors based on mutual exchange of food and support for the respective places of worship. So Balinese Hindus help them rebuild mosques and vice versa. Moreover, in several Balinese Hindu temples, offerings of pork are forbidden, which is quite significant because pork is the favorite kind of meat, both of Balinese and their demonic gods, and the main ingredient in many rituals. The explicit ban of pork is directly related to the fact that these temples were connected with Muslims, for example, with the Muslim spouse of a local king. And this is, until today, observed very carefully. This integration of different ethnic or religious traditions is particularly obvious along the north coast, where this king was living, of Buleleng, where the major harbors are located, thus connecting Bali to China, Java, and Makassar, the Sultanate of Makassar in Sulawesi, and introducing foreign traditions that were flexibly integrated in the temples of North Bali until the Batua Lake in the caldera, so uphill. This applies not only to Islamic traditions, but also to Chinese traditions. As the Batua temple shows, one of the oldest Balinese temples, where you would find a Chinese Confucian shrine, where Balinese Hindu the ancestors of the Chinese settlers from before, who have disappeared by now, by giving them offerings at now and then every opportunity for a temple festival. Similarly, Balinese rulers of Karangasem in East Bali extended the realm to the Muslim island of Lombok and had married Muslim wives and sponsored even the Hajj for their subjects. This active support of Muslims is also confirmed by Raffles, who visited Bali at the beginning of the 19th century and found that local Muslims and Balinese Shaivists not only intermarried, but that the Muslims even complained that their Raja wanted them to observe their Islamic duties more strictly, which indicates once again that difference was seen as a resource rather than a threat. However, this changed obviously during the late 19th and early 20th century, this integrative, ritually integrative form of practice. And that means after the advent of the Dutch, who reached Bali quite late and were fascinated by its ritual traditions, which they, as well as Raffles, regarded as a corrupt rest of a Indic high culture centered around the Brahmin priests and the royal centers. The courtly centers were indeed the focus of Bali's artistic traditions, dances, and gamelan orchestras. But there were also many village rituals, which have been marginalized and basically dismissed as primitive from the beginning. And what we regard now as standard Balinese rituals, such as the cremation ritual, was back then, around 1900s, only a prerogative of the kings. Balinese village rituals were not only dismissed by European Orientalists as primitive forms of animism and ancestor cult, but also later on by Balinese intellectuals themselves. Thus, Dutch colonializers and Orientalists emphasized once again, and were looping basically, a Brahmanic tradition of Balinese culture with which they regarded as the origin of Bali and the Balinese culture and the true identity. So, and this leads us to the first, I'm afraid I'm running out of time. Do I still have time? Ute, can you say a word, or Bo? Obviously not. Okay.
Well, sorry, I was looking for. Yes, you still have like 10 minutes or something like that. So
okay.
You're
so maybe not good. Okay, I will. So I try to make this very fast. So the Dutch basically started the entire enterprise of establishing Bali as a culture and giving Bali a religion by the attempt to strengthen Bali's identity as a Hindu island that would allow them to have an ally and a buffer in relation to Java and the rest of Indonesia, because in Java at that time, a struggle for independence had already started. But the Balinese god kings were not all convinced that they should cooperate with the Dutch, which led to a very dramatic and strange total end, or puputan, which means the absolute end, of the royal spiritual political centers of Bali. The Dutch made some military expeditions in which they tried to force the royal centers to capitulate. But since those kings were gods, they could not capitulate, and nor could their followers. So what they did instead was marching solemnly in their ritual dress in the cannon fire of Dutch, and those who were not killed by the Dutch army killed themselves as a ritual form of suicide with their daggers, their kris. This happened over and over again in all of the royal centers, in all of the kingdoms, and was called the Puputan, the last one being the Puputan of Klungkung in 1908, the absolute end of Bali's divine kingship, and therefore of Bali as an independent religious political polity. Only after that, after these Puputans, Balinese had to re-identify themselves, because in their perception, their Ida Batara, their gods, were gone. They were not really dead. They were still there, but in Niskala, in the invisible world. And they were quite powerful from Niskala on, because the Dutch, while the Dutch had won this fight in terms of military submission, they had lost it in terms of morality. They were highly criticized in Europe for their inhuman colonial politics, which was no longer acceptable at that time. And so they tried to support what was left from Bali by actually establishing and protecting it as a unique culture that was based on a religion which they regarded as Hinduism. And that is the turning point of Balinese history. I would like to emphasize this because from the Balinese of that time, this was a moment when the world was out of order. So their world, which was fixed by the king as the apex of a cosmology, had fallen out of order. It was in a chaotic situation, and they needed to re-establish it. And they did this with the help of the Dutch, who supported them with rituals and in their attempt to reinvent themselves. And during that time, we find a new discourse amongst the first generation of Western educated Balinese intellectuals that we can follow in several journals. like Surya Kanta of the 1920s, where those young Balinese intellectuals were asking themselves what their religion was, because it had become very important for them to identify it, since they were regarded, or religion was regarded, as the core of their culture. And you can, if you have time, you can follow these discussions where Balinese argue and complain, actually, that when they ask their parents, nobody can tell them what kind of religion they have, because the very concept of religion was absent from Bali. There was no religion. There was also not a cultural identity as Balinese. Balinese regarded themselves as the subjects of. And in this context, those Western educated Balinese then discovered several possibilities vis-a-vis the paradigm of religion that they were taught, which was on the one hand Christianity and on the other hand Islam. So in other words, Abrahamic book religions with a consistent doctrine. And they complained a lot because they said basically what Balinese reformers repeat until today. Balinese don't really know what they are doing. They have too many rituals, but they have no understanding of what that all means, because what it means is ultimately comes together in a highly complex cosmological philosophical tradition, which is only transparent to very few people who are interested in these esoteric texts and who are making the effort to study them on the one hand, and on the other hand, it is based on local animist traditions which do not really consistently match with the ideological level. So in this context, or in the same time, in Java, something else happened. Oh no, I should not forget to add this, perhaps, even though we have only a couple of minutes. And that was the moment when the Dutch offered them a concept which was equally Western and modern as the concept of religion, and that was the concept of culture. Cultuur. The Dutch offered them a highly normative concept of culture that was based basically on what we would call high culture, artistic production, dances, music, a humanist normative idea of culture, but part of this concept of culture were local, quite bloody sacrifice forms, sometimes cruel forms of sacrificing animals, but also transpossession that involves the devouring of live chicken and quite wild scenes that do not seem to match with the ideal of Bali as a highly aestheticized culture. So while for the Dutch word, Indonesians found a neologism which was kebudayaan, that translates nicely with culture, because budi is the term for a refined intellect and refers more or less to this ideal of an artistic high culture. So what did not really fit with this ideal of a modern, acceptable and humanistic high culture was put in another box, which was called adat. Adat, the Arab word for custom. Everything that was not acceptable, a cultural tradition, became an adat, and this was always suspected of being, slightly backward, terbelakangan, and not really on a par with modernity. At the same time, there was the need to define the religious core of this culture, and this leads to the last step of the construction of Balinese Hinduism, which is the national politics of the first and very charismatic president of the Indonesian Republic, Sukarno. Himself a Javanese Muslim from an aristocratic family in northern Java, and basically the embodiment of this integrative tradition of Indonesia, because his father was a Muslim, a Javanese Muslim, and a member of the Theosophical Society, and his mother was a Balinese daughter of a Brahmin household, of a Griya. So he his family represented paradigmatically this integrative practice. He himself, as you can see, was in all fields of politics very successful. He wanted to establish a kind of socialism. You see him here in this nice picture together with Khrushchev lighting cigarettes with each other. He attended a Dutch school, was very successful, obviously extremely gifted in studying languages. He was fluent in Javanese, in Balinese, Indonesian, in Dutch, but he spoke also some German, English, French, and Russian, and had studied architecture. Before or while, he was at the same time the leading figure of the nationalist movement, and later on the first president. He was very much inspired by the traditional idea of Indonesian, or rather old Javanese kingdoms and their ability to integrate diversity. And this is what brought him to establish his Panchasila state. Panchasila, the 5 pillars of the state, which were humanity and above all the national unity of the multi-ethnic and multi-religious states, and social justice, democracy, but as the first pillar, the belief in one God, so monotheism that should be or could be venerated by all religions. Now, this became the crucial point, and I would like to emphasize that there is a slight difference. While for the Balinese, the search for their own religion in the first place under the Dutch colonial role was more a matter of presenting themselves as modern people on a par with Christians and Muslims, during the national political or the building of the Indonesian nation state, it became a matter of national identity and integration. Because the belief in a monotheistic God was crucial for becoming a good Indonesian citizen. It was impossible simply to be a polytheist or animist in a minute, because you needed a creed for a proper religion to get even a passport in which your religion would be written down. So in his own perception for Sukarno, it didn't matter very much what people believed in the first place. He simply wanted religious pluralism, but he found himself in his fight for freedom from the Dutch colonial rule, side by side with the modernist Muslim organizations of that time. And these people had by then already reformed Islam and were opting for Sharia state. They actually argued quite convincingly that given the fact that almost 90% of the Indonesian population was Muslim after all, it would be only democratic to establish in the Indonesian state on the grounds of Sharia. And this was not in the interest of the Republicans, the nationalists like Sukarno, but it would also have led to a split of Indonesia, because the eastern part, the eastern islands, as I showed you initially, were mainly Christian dominated, and so they would not have joined the struggle for independence. And this led to an interesting diplomatic maneuver. Suharto sent the minister or his ally from the Nahdlatul Ulama, one of the largest Muslim organizations, as the minister. He appointed him as the minister for religion. And this made it possible that the very notion of religion was identified and defined in very normative terms. So rather than accepting that everybody could simply determine the religion he had or he believed to have, There were now several criteria according to which a proper religion, that was the basis for pluralist religion state, needed to be defined. And this criteria were a monotheist creed, of course, a holy book, kitab suci, a prophet to whom this book was revealed, and it must be a world religion rather than a local tradition, which means it must be strictly separate from any adat. And there are not so many possibilities as you can imagine, and therefore only 5 religions were accepted in the end that could be modeled after this, ultimately, as well as Islamic paradigm, but also modern paradigm of a religion as a doctrinal belief system, which is Islam, Protestantism, Catholicism, Buddhism, and later on Hinduism. But for the Balinese, this was a huge problem because the religious leaders who tried to define for more than 20 years already what the religion actually was, came up with several names. One group opted for Agama, Shiva Buddha, on the grounds of the priests, the high priests, who were Shiva or Buddha high priests. The other group opted for Agama Tirtha, because Tirtha, holy water, is actually the main essence of all Balinese rituals, and the veneration of holy springs is one of the, or holy springs per se, are one of the most sacred places in Bali. What you see here is not just a shower, it is a temple. This is how a Balinese temple looks like. Actually, it's the veneration of an element of water. That's in Tampak Siring. So, it was so the Balinese decided in the 50s to declare their religion as Agama Tirtha, the religion of holy water. But the Ministry of Religion, which was dominated by Muslims, rejected this term, and they said this is clearly animism, and classified the Balinese as backward animists, people who do not yet have a proper religion, orang yang belum beragama. And that meant in practice that they were targets for conversion, most likely to Islam. So in this very moment, the Balinese understood that the protection that they had received still under colonial rule, protection from proselytization, because the Dutch believed that their religion must be protected for the sake of the culture, was over. And they decided very quickly to redefine themselves as Hindu. And ever since then, Balinese have become Hindu, but not before. And that's very important to understand. So, they had to convince, first of all, the president Sukarno, which they did. They sent a delegation and convinced him that Bali had a religion which was actually the oldest world religion. It was Hinduism, Agama Hindu, and it had holy books, the Veda, which were totally unknown in Bali. When Balinese speak of a priest, Maveda, which is basically a verbal form to doing the Veda, it means simply that he speaks mantras. The Veda as such were not known, and they were not known to anyone. And the rishis that they were referring to, who had received the Veda, were actually local, spiritual experts that had received the revelation of the holy Lontar books, which could not really be regarded as a version of the Veda. So they were only regarded as a corrupt local version of Veda until today by the reformers. And this is basically the impression that the Dutch already had many years ago. And since then, 2 things are happening. Balinese are reforming their own religious traditions in terms of a universal global Hinduism. They have established vis-a-vis the Hajj in Java and elsewhere in Indonesia, a pilgrimage tour to India called Tirtha Yatra, where they happily believe that they discover the origin of their own Agama Hindu. And at the same time, they continue doing the rituals which are in practically no way reconcilable with Hinduism in India, I would say. So you could ask yourself, you are the specialist for India, is this Agama Hindu or is it rather local Adat? That's a picture of the Maligia, a very specific Balinese ancestor ritual that hasn't received enough attention, I think, in the literature, because everybody is talking about the cremation ritual, which has now become a popular rite for every Balinese Hindu. But 12 years perhaps after the cremation, you have a second cremation, and that's the Maligia. And there are no bones and nothing left because the corpse is already cremated. What you have here is the spiritual sitting place of the body, of the invisible body of your personal ancestor. And this is the so-called puspa, the flower made of dried leaves and several other ingredients. And so why do they do it? It's a deification ritual for your personal ancestor. You want to deify him and put him in your household shrine or on the top of the Gunung Agung, the holy mountain, so that you can pray to him. And the question is this now ultimate liberation, moksha, as the Balinese would call it? Do they want moksha, or what are they striving for? And this here is a part of this ritual, a very important part, where Balinese in the temple are collecting sacred banyan leaves, because the banyan tree is believed to be a tree of immortality. And they are wrapped around these puspas before they are burned. And what you see here is a certain pattern of wrapping them. You have to fold them together and then make a kind of chain of those leaves. And you would perhaps not believe it, but what these leaves represent is actually intercourse. So these are, if you want to call it that, fertility elements, which are wrapped around the effigy of the ancestor and are related to the Balinese conviction that reincarnation is the best thing that can happen, because it happens always in your own family. That's a very strong practice. And if you would ask them now why they as Hindus are doing this, they would refer to their creed, to their Hindu creed, and would say this is for the sake of moksha. But if you look more closely at the symbolism of the ritual and the whole dramaturgy and aesthetics, you would find that it equally emphasizes reincarnation and fertility much more than ultimate liberation. So this is one of those inconsistencies which are elegantly performed in Balinese rituals, that you can, as you always did, have one belief system and do something else that adds to it, but one should not easily believe what many Balinese would tell you, that this is only a local Balinese version of what Hindus do anyways. So I'm coming to the end. This shows that there is a moment again where the term of religion, or the identification in terms of a modern religion as a modern belief system, creates contradictions. But this is not only on the level of rituals, it is also happening within the Hindu community of Balinese, because now Balinese are fighting about the right interpretation of Hinduism. On the one hand, you have reformers, democratic reformers of the Sudra commoner majority of Balinese, and they would argue that Balinese Hinduism is indeed a world religion, to which everybody can contribute, where everybody can be a priest if he or she is able to study the texts, mainly the Veda and the Bhagavad Gita. And so the role of the Ida Padanda, the high priest, and even more so the role of this spiritual, mystical power of Shakti is no longer important. On the other hand, you have traditionalists coming from Brahmin families who would strongly oppose this and argue that this is actually the ruin of Balinese religion and of what it always was, and that only Brahmin priests have not only the right, but mostly the ability, due to their inherent mystical power, to perform the mantras correctly and to imbue the holy water with energy, and to preserve a tradition that would otherwise be destroyed. So in their opinion, Balinese Hinduism is something entirely different, and these groups are fighting constantly. There is a third group, and this is the old pre-Majapahit nobility, the Pasek and the Pandey, who never accepted the role of the Padandas and are now also part of this conflict. In other words, the normative concept of a religion has led to internal diversification on the one hand, but also to many conflicts that did not happen before. That's one thing. On the other hand, you have much more conflicts between Balinese and Muslims now than ever before, because at the same time, the same purification process happened in the context of Java and other Muslim places of Indonesia. And there is right now a conflict about tourism in Bali. Increasingly, Indonesian tourists visit Bali as well, and they visit Bali on halal tours, where they are guided to hotels which provide halal food and everything, so that they can make their photos like normal tourists from the West of Balinese temples. But there are also attempts to establish Sharia tours, which would force the Balinese, obviously, to adopt more or to adjust even more to the paradigm of the predominant Muslim society. And this has been strongly opposed by Balinese, who, since the Bali bombings, regard Muslims as inherently dangerous and problematic. Also, because there are so many more Muslims who try to profit from the Balinese tourism industry and settle in Bali without, as the Balinese would say it, respecting their local traditions. So a person who lives in a Balinese village should, according to local traditions, contribute to the gotong royong, the mutual neighborhood help for the rituals. But Muslims argue now that this is not their religion, not their agama, and so they withdraw from it while they make money with the emblematic Balinese culture, and that too leads to increasing conflict. And so to come to an end, several forms of integration, interreligious integration, are now increasingly marginalized, and I would like to recall or mention only a few. For example, in a village next to the one where I did most of my research in southern Bali, there was a Muslim migrant worker years ago who was highly respected, and where Balinese Hindus would always praise him because he went to the Balinese temple for rituals, as they saw it, just to respect their local gods. And not only that, he would go in trance during a temple ritual and channel the local god. So he would perform the god. And when I was confused and said, well, how is this possible? He is Muslim. Nobody would ever put in question that he was a good Muslim, because in Balinese understandings, being in trance is nothing what has to do with your personality or psychology, but simply the God chooses a person who is respectful and pure to manifest himself. So this man was regarded as a good Muslim that at the same time was a respectful member of this village. And such forms of cooperation are happening until today, but only in the old Muslim settlements of Bali and not in those new settlements where modernist Muslims from Java come and build mosques with loudspeakers, therefore creating a lot of tension and conflict with their Balinese environment. So I think I will stop at that point and leave the rest to a discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.